What if the gods didn't disappear from Earth, but instead mastered ruling without visibility? Mesopotamian records document something unusual. Deities who once decided matters with humans and then ceased to show up while all their creations stayed intact. This isn't imaginary storytelling. It's captured in thousands of cuneiform tablets covering 3,000 years of unbroken society. Temple records, royal engravings, legal systems, ceremonial guidelines. The writings portray divine entities known as the Anunnaki, overseers, arbiters, decree issuers who allocated cities, apportioned universal power, and moved among people as observable leaders. And then following the Great Deluge, they just retreated. But here's what renders this eerie. Nothing really altered. Monarchs still governed via divine command. Clerics still protected sacred wisdom. Regulations still originated from the heavens. Shrines still served as links to the celestial realm. The whole framework of authority stayed complete. Only the deities themselves stopped being bodily there. The proof for this isn't hidden in limited collections. It's been deciphered and released in scholarly publications for more than 100 years. It resides in museums around the globe, etched on clay slabs no bigger than your palm. These aren't legends found separately. They're managerial documents, monarch rosters, legal introductions, and ceremonial directives that outline a ruling structure asserting beginnings outside humanity. One record seizes this shift with alarming sharpness. It's named the Sumerian King List, kept in various versions across multiple dig sites. The fullest edition was unearthed in 1922 by a British team at the remnants of Larsa, an old Sumerian settlement in today's southern Iraq. What renders this document extraordinary isn't merely its antiquity, it's its format. The King List is composed in two clear parts divided by one disastrous occurrence. Prior to the flood, it logs kingship as an element that came down from heaven, not symbolically, but as an actual handover of control from the godly domain to earth. It specifies particular cities, particular leaders, particular chains of command. Following the flood, it proceeds in precisely the same factual manner, listing monarchs, settlements, and lineages. But now it features rulers we recognize as historically authentic. Excavation evidence verifies their reality. Their carvings have been dug up. Their towns have been revealed. Gilgamesh shows up in this roster. So does Enmebaragesi of Kish, whose title was discovered on real shrine objects. These aren't legendary personas. They're actual people from history. This poses an unavoidable issue for standard analysis. If the after-flood part of the King List is regarded as true historical, account and conventional academics do regard it, then how can we reject the before-flood part when it's penned by the identical writers in the identical manner as component of the identical ongoing story? The record draws no separation. It depicts godly governance and human governance as one continuous sequence of control disrupted solely by the deluge. But the King List is merely the start. Throughout thousands of Mesopotamian writings covering Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian eras, a steady motif appears. Initial stories portray deities as engaged choice-makers who designated territories, settled conflicts, proclaimed orders, and oversaw the world straight through evident existence. Subsequent writings portray those identical deities as origins of control, still bestowing kingship, still supplying regulations, still requiring compliance, but now working via human agents. Clerics decipher divine intent through ceremony. Monarchs govern as designated delegates. Fairness is dispensed in the deity's name. The deities are absent physically, but they're still commanding. This isn't a tale about deities vanishing from human thought. Every society has legends that diminish. This is about something much odder. A ruling framework that keeps operating as if the deities are observing even after they cease manifesting. A society that acts as though authority stems from outside humanity and never doubts if that authority really departed. which leads to the query that forms all that comes next. If the Anunnaki were once depicted as leaders who strode on earth, gave orders, and ruled straight, and if the frameworks they set up, godly kingship, clerical intercession, celestial law, holy lineages, stayed entirely functional after they retreated, then what sort of vanishing abandons a world that still complies? If you're attracted to the enigmas concealed in old documents, subscribe to accompany us as we decode them. Tell me in the comments from where you're tuning in and what time it is there. I enjoy learning this material journeys across time zones, like these ancient tales journeyed across eras. The images in this video are present to enhance mood, but they aren't essential to track along. Shut your eyes if you prefer. Allow the proof to express itself. To grasp what the Anunnaki's retreat truly signifies, we must first grasp what their existence resembled in the oldest origins. Not as artistic emblems, not as remote universal energies, but as something much more exact. Overseers with designated duties, decision-forming groups, and immediate control over worldly matters. Let's begin with what the ancient writings really outline. The ancient writings don't outline a leaving. There's no goodbye address, no ultimate order, no spectacular rise into the skies noted in the manner societies usually honor key happenings. What the Mesopotamian archive displays instead is something more understated and much more disturbing. The deities just cease manifesting in the same fashion. Early stories show divine entities rendering choices, allocating areas, arbitrating disagreements, actively joining in the oversight of the world. Later writings still mention those identical entities, still call upon their control, still assert their commands. But now the deities function through pathways, through monarchs who represent them, clerics who decipher their intent, ceremonies that sustain connection, and signs that indicate their aims. The framework persists. The origin turns unseen. Mesopotamia provides us the most extended continuous scripted archive of any old society. Over 3,000 years of cuneiform engravings kept on clay slabs. This isn't an oral legacy sifted through ages of recounting. It's records, managerial documents, temple collections, royal chronicles, legal systems, ceremonial directions, correspondences, bills, invocations. It's scripted recollection. And inside that recollection, the Anunnaki emerge not as a contemporary plot creation, but as a steady classification in Mesopotamian spiritual vocabulary. The word arises across Sumerian chants, Akkadian sagas, Babylonian supplications, and Assyrian royal engravings. At times they're portrayed as a deity assembly, at times as fate arbiters, at times as the group name for gods who came down to earth to set up order. They're identified, they're given duties, they're summoned in judicial processes and crowning events. But then the archive alters. The earliest legends like the Atrahasis saga and the Eridu Genesis portray the Anunnaki resolving to form humanity, designating work, overseeing assets, stepping in directly when issues occur. The deities don't merely subsist in these tales. They operate, they argue, they proclaim orders called me in Sumerian universal rules that regulate everything from kingship to metalworking to shrine building. Godly existence is practical. But by the era we arrive at historical times, the lineages whose leaders left engravings on base stones and cylinder stamps, something has basically shifted. Monarchs still assert their seats were bestowed by the deities. Clerics still execute ceremonies to sustain godly approval. Regulations still call upon celestial control. Yet the deities themselves no longer manifest as figures in the story of everyday ruling. They've turned into originators of control rather than participants inside it. At the same time, the foundation they allegedly set up stays wholly undamaged. Think about what persists after this alteration. Cities still possess guardian deities whose shrines work as financial and political hubs. Kingship is still portrayed as coming down from heaven. Royal announcements. Fairness is still presented as the fulfillment of godly intent rather than human creation. Clerics uphold complex methods of prophecy, examining livers, watching stars, deciphering oil designs in water to detect what the now missing deities wish. The apparatus of godly rule keeps operating without the bodily existence of its handlers. This poses a historical enigma that standard analysis finds hard to settle. If the Anunnaki were simply emblematic depictions of natural energies or conceptual ideas, as conventional academics frequently propose, why do the writings handle them as historical overseers before the deluge and as continuing origins of control after it? Why doesn't the story format alter? The writers who noted the Sumerian King List, who duplicated the Atrahasis saga, who etched Hammurabi's law system, who recorded shrine ceremonies across ages, they drew no separation between the era when deities governed straight and the era when deities governed via agents. To them, it was one unbroken framework. The shift isn't indicated by emergency in the writings. There's no battle that forces the deities away, no loss, no uprising that triumphs. The deluge upsets the world surely, but after the waters subside, kingship promptly comes down from heaven once more. According to the King List, control resumes exactly where it halted, just directed through alternate pathways. This is what renders the Mesopotamian archive so odd when matched to other old mythologies. Greek deities ultimately turn into writing tools. Egyptian gods slowly merge into conceptual ideas, but Mesopotamian godly control never turns symbolic in their own writings. It turns mediated. The deities don't dissolve into verse, they dissolve into process. Every crowning event calls upon their sanction. Every law system asserts their creation. Every shrine ceremony sustains the link. Every sign reading pursues their direction. The whole society keeps aligning itself toward entities who are no longer visibly there, but whose non-presence somehow fortifies rather than diminishes the framework asserting their control. Which leads to the query that outlines this whole probe. If the Anunnaki were once portrayed as choice makers in the world, what did that governance really resemble in the oldest origins? And what precisely shifts later? To grasp what godly governance resembled in the earliest Mesopotamian origins, you must discard the notion of deities as remote universal energies sporadically stepping into human matters. The writing outlines something much more organized. In legends like the Atrahasis saga and Enuma Elish, the Anunnaki don't govern via wonders or enigmatic energies. They gather in councils. They argue paths of action. They ballot on choices. They designate particular duties to particular gods, splitting the work of overseeing the world the way a regime splits managerial divisions. Enki gains control over the underground freshwater domain, the Abzu, which manages irrigation and growth. Enlil rules the air, winds, and tempests that decide farming outcomes. Inanna asserts control over combat, affection, and the planet Venus. Utu handles fairness and supervises vows. Ninhursag oversees birth and the vitality of creatures. These aren't artistic duties. They're practical authorities. The Sumerian idea of me, at times rendered as godly orders or universal directives, seizes this managerial essence flawlessly. The me weren't vague principles. They were the basic elements of society: kingship, clergy, law, armaments, melody, script, intimacy, truth-speaking, artistry. In Sumerian lore, these weren't human creations that developed slowly. They were planned frameworks granted as a full set directing how community should work. The legend Inanna and Enki portrays the goddess Inanna obtaining the me from Enki and transporting them to her city of Uruk, actually shifting civilization's running guidelines from one godly overseer to another. The deities in this setup are universal officials handling the plan of being. But then, and this is vital, this managerial structure doesn't stay in the domain of legend. It turns into the actual organizing rule of Mesopotamian city-states. Each key city asserted a guardian deity who possessed that city in a judicial sense. Uruk was Inanna's, Eridu was Enki's, Nippur was Enlil's. It belonged to the moon god Nana. These weren't emblematic bonds. Temple records note that the deity was the city's proprietor, and the human residents were renter-cultivators laboring on godly land. The temple wasn't merely a spiritual structure. It was the managerial base of the guardian deity's property. Priests weren't spiritual advisors in the contemporary sense. They were asset supervisors, bookkeepers, and officials overseeing the deity's assets. Temple sites hired hundreds of laborers, bakers, brewers, herders, weavers, writers. They managed huge farming areas. They gathered taxes presented as sacrifices. They allocated portions to laborers. They maintained detailed logs of all items entering and exiting. Archaeological digs have retrieved thousands of these managerial slabs from temple collections. They log grain deliveries, fabric output, animal tallies, work assignments, property transactions, the whole financial apparatus of a city arranged around the idea that the deity bodily lived in the temple's core sanctum and needed physical upkeep. Picture a city at sunrise in 3rd millennium Sumer. Farmers deliver shares of their yield to the temple site. Writers positioned in the yard log each submission on clay slabs, refreshing the stock in the deity's storage. Within, priests ready the dawn repast. Bread, beer, grilled flesh, placing it before the worship figure in the sanctum. Performers play. Incense smolders. The ceremony announces the deity there, ingesting the sacrifice, ruling from this bodily spot. At the same time, the monarch who governs as the deity's named delegate renders verdicts in judicial conflicts but structures each choice as imposing godly law rather than individual control. Borders between plots are holy because the deities allocate the terrain. Agreements are vowed before godly observers. Fairness doesn't stem from human logic. It stems from upholding the universal order the deities founded. This framework doesn't differentiate between spiritual and political control because the whole society is crafted as an expansion of godly management. But then the query turns unavoidable. If deities once oversaw this framework straight, dwelling in shrines, accepting sacrifices, proclaiming orders through oracles and signs, why does the identical structure persist after the deities cease manifesting bodily? Why do shrines still work as financial hubs even when the deities become missing proprietors? Why do monarchs still assert their control descends from heaven even when heaven ceases dispatching evident verification? Why do priests still decipher godly intent even when that intent comes only as emblematic indicators rather than immediate exchange? The apparatus survives the handlers. Think about what this signifies. A society can be organized around godly control so deeply that the deity's bodily existence becomes elective. The framework they crafted keeps imposing compliance, arranging work, allocating assets, and validating power, all while working as if the deities are still observing from the sanctum's core room. The managerial framework turns self-sustaining. This is what renders the Mesopotamian shift so distinct from mere legendary development. Greek deities fade into tales. Roman deities get merged into thought. But Mesopotamian deities shift from engaged overseers to authorizing origins. And the society scarcely observes because the processes they founded stay unaltered. The orders still hold strength. The shrines still possess control. The kingship still comes down from heaven. Only now humans perform every duty while crediting it to godly source. Which poses the most disturbing query of this whole probe. If the deities ruled via orders and city shrines, what occurs when monarchs start asserting those orders as their own control without the deities bodily manifesting? At the same time, something extraordinary was occurring in the format of political control itself. While shrines worked as godly managerial hubs, parallel framework arose that would demonstrate even more lasting. The concept of kingship as a celestial establishment rather than a human creation. The Sumerian King List states this clearly in its initial statement. After the kingship came down from heaven, the kingship was an Eridu, not founded, not formed, not gained, came down. The wording is intentional and steady across various duplicates of the text discovered at diverse locations spanning ages. Kingship subsists first in the godly domain, then moves downward to earth as a full framework, already planned, already sanctioned, already valid before any human seizes it. This isn't exclusive to the King List. It's the basic assumption of Mesopotamian political concept. Royal engravings from every era, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, reiterate the identical pattern with ceremonial accuracy. Monarchs don't grab power via might or communal backing, at least not in their formal speech. They're selected by the deities, summoned by name, placed on the seat by godly order. Their control streams downward from an origin outside human community. Think about the engraving of Ur-Nammu, creator of the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BC. When Anu and Enlil had bestowed the kingship of Ur to Nana, monarch of the city, gazed with approval upon me, Ur-Nammu, and secured my rule upon the throne of Ur. Or Hammurabi, whose law system introduction starts when the exalted Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, decided the fate of the land. They bestowed to Marduk supreme governance over all peoples. At that time, Anu and Enlil designated me Hammurabi to establish the rule of fairness in the land. The motif repeats without end. The monarch obtains his seat. His governance is secured. His name is summoned. His fate is decided always by godly deed, never by human selection alone. This isn't ritual embellishment, inserted afterward. It's the origin code of validity. In a realm of rival city-states where limits change and lineages ascend and descend via conquest and partnership, the issue of who holds the right to govern turns vital. Armed strength can capture a seat, but it can't defend retaining it. Riches can purchase allegiance, but it can't form duty. Custom can safeguard a lineage, but it can't authorize the initial monarch. Only heaven can achieve that. By rooting control in the godly domain, kingship turns into something that surpasses human politics. A monarch selected by the deities isn't merely mightier than his competitors. He's universally valid. Resisting him isn't uprising against a strong individual. It's opposition to the structure of the cosmos itself. It's a ruling technology more potent than any force. But then the intriguing element appears. The King List depicts this godly sourced control as ongoing across the deluge limit. Before the disaster, kingship comes down from heaven and moves through 8 leaders across 5 cities. The deluge sweeps across, and then promptly kingship comes down from heaven again to the city of Kish, and the list proceeds without break. The establishment endures the end times. More significantly, the list draws no separation in format or control between the before-flood monarchs, whose rules cover incredibly extended spans, and the after-flood leaders who turn historically confirmable. Gilgamesh of Uruk appears in the identical factual layout as Alulim of Eridu. Both obtain their kingship from the identical origin. Both govern with the identical godly command. The King List handles mythic era and historical era as one ongoing sequence of valid control coming down from heaven via an uninterrupted series of named leaders. This forms a rhetorical triumph by merging the holy past with the historical now in one fluid story. The list implies that present monarchs govern with the identical godly sanction as the mythic personas of old. The era of deities striding on earth may have concluded, but the tool they founded. Kingship as celestial establishment keeps working flawlessly. Control doesn't need godly existence. It only needs godly source. And once that rule becomes embraced, the issue of whether deities still actively step in turns almost unimportant. The framework runs on the assumption that power streams from above, no matter whether the origin stays evident. Think about what this signifies in action. A monarch rising to the seat in historical Mesopotamia would join in detailed crowning ceremonies crafted to show godly choice. He would access the shrine of the city's guardian deity. Priests would execute rituals calling upon the god's sanction. Holy items would be offered. Vows would be pledged. The whole process enacted the instant of godly naming, creating, evident what the concept asserted was occurring invisibly. The ceremony forms the truth it outlines. And because kingship is godly sourced, it turns inheritable in manners that purely human control never could. A son doesn't merely follow his father via biological chance. He obtains the godly command handed down through a holy bloodline. Lineage turns theology. Family sequence turns cosmic persistence. The wording of godly naming changes from spiritual faith into political foundation. But here's where the framework discloses its most essential trait. If monarchs govern because heaven sanctions them, then someone must manage entry to heaven's voice. Someone must decipher godly intent. Someone must verify that the deities have truly selected this specific person to obtain the descending kingship. The shrines weren't merely financial devices handling godly assets, though they surely were that. They were also the exchange pathways through which godly control could be confirmed, deciphered, and when needed, rerouted. Priests didn't merely oversee the deity's properties. They verified the deity's political choices, which means that the retreat of immediate godly existence doesn't diminish the framework, it possibly bolsters it. Because now, instead of deities rendering their selections evident for everyone to witness, those selections must be perceived through ceremony, sign, oracle, and priestly deciphering. The agents turn essential. If monarchs govern because heaven sanctions them, who manages entry to heaven's voice? And what occurs when that entry turns an establishment? The solution to who manages heaven's voice resides in the design itself. Shrines in Mesopotamia weren't mainly crafted as assembly areas for group devotion the way contemporary spiritual structures operate. They were crafted as homes, actual dwellings for gods who were thought to reside bodily inside the innermost sanctum. The deity lived in the worship figure. The figure needed maintenance, and that maintenance required a lasting professional group with sole entry to the godly existence. Introduce the priests. But to grasp what priests really did, you must look beyond spiritual ritual and inspect the financial truth. Shrine collections recovered from locations like Lagash and Nippur disclose organizations handling astonishing intricacy. Thousands of laborers, huge farming assets, large-scale manufacturing of fabrics and beer, long-distance commerce systems, and advanced bookkeeping methods, tracking everything down to single portions of grain and oil. One collection from the city of Gursu holds over 30,000 managerial slabs, covering just a few decades in the 21st century BC. They log daily shrine activities in thorough detail. How many sheep were killed? Which laborers got barley portions? What fields were sown? Which items were exchanged? When celebrations needed extra assets. These weren't sacred men pondering the divine. These were officials overseeing an intricate entity that worked as the financial foundation of the city-state. But the brilliance of the framework was that financial power and spiritual control were indivisible because the deity possessed the terrain, managed the excess, and sanctioned all allocation of assets. Every financial deal turned a spiritual deed. Farmers didn't submit taxes to a regime. They offered sacrifices to the god. Laborers didn't get pay from a boss. They got portions from the deity's home. Legal pacts weren't imposed by civic control. They were vowed before godly observers who would penalize vow breakers. The shrine was the connection through which godly intent showed as financial and political truth. At the same time, the priestly group built another type of soul entry, even stronger than financial oversight: literacy. In a community where script was a specialized ability needing years of instruction, writers, who were frequently priests or shrine managers, managed the creation and deciphering of all scripted wisdom. They wrote the royal engravings asserting godly naming. They upheld the shrine collections logging godly assets. They duplicated the old legends outlining how the deities founded society. They were the guardians of memory itself. But even more importantly, they managed the technical wisdom needed to exchange with the missing deities. When godly existence turns unseen, society requires ways to perceive godly intent. Mesopotamian culture built detailed methods of prophecy, ceremonial technologies crafted to pull data from the godly domain through emblematic deciphering. Extispacy, the examining of animal innards, turned the most esteemed type. Trained experts would offer a sheep, extract its liver, and inspect every aspect of its form, feel, and hue, matching what they saw against vast sign catalogs assembled over ages. The liver wasn't an arbitrary item. It was thought to be a note penned by the deities specifically answering the query asked before the offering. Oil prophecy functioned likewise. A priest would drip oil onto water in a holy vessel and decipher the forms created. How the oil dispersed, whether it dropped or drifted, what shapes arose as godly exchange. Celestial watching followed the paths of planets, the emergence of eclipses, odd atmospheric events. Anything that disrupted regular patterns could be examined as an indicator. Vast astronomical logs noted these happenings alongside matching earthly events, forming a database of links between celestial indicators and worldly results. The reasoning was refined. If deities live in heaven and heaven is always evident, then heaven's paths hold encoded notes for those instructed to examine them. But observe what this framework demands. Experts, specialists, a professional group with years of instruction in intricate interpretive structures that common folk cannot reach. The deities might dispatch indicators, but only priests can unravel them. Godly intent turns something generated through ceremonial technology rather than something straight experienced. Picture the setting: a shadowed shrine at midnight, priests assembled around an offered animal, lamp glow dancing across the revealed organs. Total quiet as the chief diviner inspects the liver's exterior, hunting for anomalies that might signal godly approval or disapproval about the monarch's war effort. The deity has retreated from evident existence, but this ceremony renders the deity's verdict evident. The note is there in the feel of the flesh, in the layout of lobes, in the subtle differences from the anticipated pattern. It just demands deciphering, and whoever manages deciphering manages the godly voice. This is how control works without existence. The deities need not manifest for their intent to be recognized. They need only leave indicators, and indicators demand examiners. Priests don't supplant the deities. They turn vital agents without whom godly control cannot be reached. The retreat forms reliance. But then something even weirder appears in the historical archive. Monarchs begin releasing law systems, as if the laws themselves were obtained from the deities rather than created by human leaders. Ur-Nammu's code, the oldest known, offers its judicial verdicts as component of the monarch's godly command to found fairness in the land per the orders of the deities, Nana and Utu. Lipit Ishtar's code likewise structures its laws as accomplishing godly directions. Hammurabi's renowned stele shows the monarch obtaining the emblems of control straight from the sun deity Shamash, before cataloging nearly 300 case regulations. The laws aren't portrayed as practical answers to societal issues. They're offered as universal rules conveyed from heaven to earth via the agent of godly selected kingship, which signifies that compliance to law turns compliance to the deities themselves. Violating a legal system isn't just a civic breach. It's a disturbance of godly order, punishable not merely by worldly powers, but by universal energies. Fairness itself turns externalized, credited to an origin outside human community. And who deciphers whether fairness has been delivered? Who decides if a verdict matches godly intent? Who upholds the logs of legal example and guarantees correct ceremonial processes are observed in tribunals? The identical priestly group that oversees the shrines, examines the signs, and manages entry to scripted wisdom. The framework closes into flawless loop. Monarchs govern by godly command. Laws originate from heaven. Priests decipher both kingship and law via their soul entry to godly exchange. And the whole structure defends itself by mention to deities who are no longer there to affirm or refute any of it. Control streams from an unseen origin through pathways managed by establishments, imposing compliance to an intent that can only be recognized through specialized deciphering. If priests turn the decoders of the deities, what occurs when law itself is structured as godly conveyance, securing society into compliance to an invisible origin? But then the most refined tool of the whole framework emerges. Law itself offered as godly conveyance rather than human formation. Think about the renowned law code of Hammurabi, etched onto a black basalt stele around 1750 BC, and now positioned in the Louvre. The relic is almost 8 feet tall, and its top part shows the monarch standing before the seated sun deity Shamash, obtaining the emblems of fairness and kingship. A rod and ring symbolizing control to gauge and bind, to found order and impose limits. The picture sets the bond before one law is catalogued. The monarch doesn't create fairness. He obtains it. The introduction renders this clear across dozens of lines of meticulously written text when the exalted Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, who decides the fates of the land, decided for Marduk, the firstborn of Enki. The Enlil rolls over all humanity, rendered him great among the Igigi, named Babylon by its lofty name, rendered it supreme in the world, founded for him in its center an enduring kingship. At that time Anu and Enlil designated me to advance the well-being of the people. Me, Hammurabi, the pious, God-revering prince, to make fairness prevail in the land, to eliminate the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not harm the weak. The format of the phrase counts. The deities act initially. They decide, they found, they designate. Hammurabi's duty is derived. He's summoned, designated, assigned to perform a task, planned by godly control. Then arrive nearly 300 case laws addressing everything from asset conflicts to healing errors, from legacy rights to wrong claims, from farming pacts to physical harm. Each tracks the same if-then layout. If a specific circumstance happens, then this particular outcome ensues. But these aren't offered as the monarch's practical answers to social issues. They're universal principles rendered evident through royal imposition. The conclusion strengthens this structuring. The verdicts which I have declared, the choices which I have delivered, let any injured man who has a dispute come before the figure of me, the King of Fairness, and let him have my etched stele recited to him. Let him listen to my valuable words, and may my stele explain his case for him. The figure speaks. The stone itself turns an oracle of godly fairness. What seems to be human law works as disclosure. This motif stretches well beyond Hammurabi. Ur-Nammu's earlier code starts with godly approval. The deities. An and Enlil bestow kingship to Nana, who then raises Ur-Nammu with the command to found fairness in the land. Lipit Ishtar's code likewise begins with the deity Enlil summoning the monarch by name and commanding him to found fairness in Sumer and Akkad. Even the more broken law systems from Eshnunna and later Assyrian eras uphold this pattern. Control comes down from heaven. Monarchs perform godly orders, and laws stand for cosmic order placed on human community. The mental strength of this setup cannot be exaggerated. When law stems from human lawmakers, it can be doubted, reformed, or dismissed through political method. Laws turn bargainable statements of present social agreement, always open to change based on shifting situations or superior logic. But when law originates from the deities, opposition changes into something much more risky than political disagreement. It turns blasphemy, a test to the format of reality itself. Violating a godly sanctioned law isn't simply unlawful. It's universally incorrect. The wrong stretches beyond the worldly tribunal into the domain of godly verdict. Even if human imposition fails, the deities observe all. Even if you avoid worldly penalty, universal results persist. This is how retreat operates without vanishing. The deities don't need to be bodily there in tribunals to impose their laws. They don't need to manifest personally to judge disputes. The whole legal framework runs on the assumption that godly control founded these principles. That godly fairness supports every decision, and that godly punishment awaits those who breach the cosmic order, even if that punishment isn't promptly evident. The danger of all-seeing supervision substitutes the need for immediate stepping in. And because monarchs govern as godly named executives of celestial fairness, their political strength turns morally undoubtable. Complying with the monarch isn't merely wise self-concern or civic responsibility. It's spiritual duty. The seat turns holy. The lineage turns sacred. Opposition turns transgression. At the same time, this motif of godly law isn't unique to Mesopotamia. Throughout old societies divided by location and culture, the identical pattern emerges. Law stems outside humanity, needing only human overseers to impose cosmic principles that subsisted before any worldly leader. In Old Egypt, the idea of Ma'at stood for cosmic order, truth, and fairness, not as vague philosophy, but as a godly rule founded by the deities at creation. Pharaohs governed as upholders of Ma'at, imposing laws that safeguarded cosmic equilibrium rather than creating fresh social setups. The pharaoh wasn't the origin of law. He was its worldly protector. The Hebrew lore offers the law of Moses as actually spoken by Yahweh on Mount Sinai, commands etched in stone by godly hand, not human creation. The laws ruling old Israel assert immediate celestial creation. Complying with them means complying with God. Dismissing them means betrayal. In China, the idea of the mandate of heaven validated imperial governance through godly choice. While the mandate could be retracted, permitting dynastic shift when leaders turned corrupt, the control itself always streamed from heaven downward to earth. Human emperors oversaw cosmic order. They didn't form it. Even in Greece, where thoughtful doubting ultimately tested traditional control, early city-states credited their laws to godly origins, like Lycurgus of Sparta allegedly obtained his constitution from the oracle at Delphi. Minos of Crete asserted to obtain laws straight from Zeus. The validity originated from heaven, even in cultures that would earlier code starts with godly approval. The deities An and Enlil bestow kingship to Nana, who then raises Ur-Nammu with the command to found fairness in the land. Lipit Ishtar's code likewise begins with the deity Enlil summoning the monarch by name and commanding him to found fairness in Sumer and Akkad. Even that never connected with each other. Law doesn't stem with humanity. Control comes from above. And ruling means imposing principles founded by energies outside human community, which implies either an amazing coincidence in how power defends itself, or something more basic about how control structures itself when asserting validity outside human agreement. If godly control lasts even after godly existence diminishes, why do other societies narrate the identical tale? Deities once near, then far. Yet power stays from above. The solution resides in acknowledging that this isn't a Mesopotamian oddity. It's a worldwide motif throughout societies that grew separately, divided by thousands of miles and ages of time. The identical story format emerges. Deities once evident, deities now remote, control still asserting godly source and power, streaming through agents who manage entry to the retreated godly domain. The details vary. The titles alter. The spiritual setups differ. but the design stays amazingly steady. Think about Old Egypt. The earliest Egyptian spiritual writings, the pyramid texts etched inside Old Kingdom royal graves around 2300 BC, portrayed deities striding on earth during a primeval era. Ra governed as the initial pharaoh before retreating into the sky. Osiris ruled the living before his demise and change into lord of the underworld. The lore keeps memory of an era when godly entities held earthly seats straight. But by the historical lineages, the deities no longer govern in bodily shape. Instead, pharaohs turn living deities, not symbolically, but spiritually. The pharaoh is the worldly display of Horus, the godly sun, upholding Ma'at on behalf of the heavenly order. Godly control persists, but now directed through a human form that connects the divide between heaven and earth. The shrine sites work as the main connection with godly strength. Huge stone buildings, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, act as homes for the deities, where daily ceremonies uphold cosmic equilibrium. Priests execute the identical duties as their Mesopotamian peers, overseeing vast financial assets, managing literacy and holy wisdom, deciphering signs, and mediating between the unseen godly domain and worldly community. The deities have retreated into figures, into ceremony, into specialized wisdom. But their control over Egyptian society stays total. At the same time, in the Hebrew lore logged in biblical writings, the identical motif appears with striking sharpness. The Genesis story portrays Yahweh striding in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day, conversing straight with Adam in prompt bodily nearness. God manifests to Abraham, struggles with Jacob, converses face to face with Moses. The early sections of the Hebrew Bible show godly existence as reachable, even dialogic. But then gradually that promptness diminishes. After the Exodus and the founding of the tabernacle, God converses through the Ark of the Covenant from behind a curtain, only to the high priest, only on particular sacred days. By the era of the monarchs, godly exchange demands prophets, specialized agents who obtain visions, hear voices, and decipher indicators that common folk cannot reach. The prophets themselves mourn this remoteness. Isaiah logs God's words. Truly, you are a God who conceals himself. The Psalms shout out questioning why God seems missing. The whole format of Israelite faith grows around overseeing a bond with a God who was once near, but has turned distant. Yet, and this is essential, godly control over law, kingship, and social order never lessens. The Torah originates from Sinai. Monarchs govern under godly command. Fairness streams from orders given by God. The pact stays binding. Compliance is still demanded. Only now that compliance is mediated through priests, prophets, shrine ceremony, and textual deciphering, the framework lasts without immediate godly existence. In Greece, the motif emerges in varied spiritual wording, but with the identical underlying format. Hesiod's Works and Days outlines a golden era when deities and humans coexist, eating at the same feasts, sharing the same areas. The deities were evident, observable, engaging. But successive eras, silver, bronze, iron, outline growing distance between the godly and human domains. By the historical era, the deities have retreated to Mount Olympus, stepping into human matters only sometimes, indirectly through visions, signs, or brief displays. Yet their control over fate, fairness, and cosmic order stays unaltered. And how do humans reach godly intent? Through oracles. The oracle at Delphi turns the most renowned. Priestesses breathing sacred fumes, entering altered states, offering cryptic foretellings that demand priestly deciphering. Monarchs consult the oracle before rendering choices. City-states pursue godly direction through ceremonial processes managed by specialized shrine staff. The deities are distant, but their voices can still be reached through meticulously overseen pathways. Even in China, where the spiritual setup varies dramatically from Mediterranean lores, the identical design emerges. The idea of the mandate of heaven places the emperor as the agent between celestial order and worldly ruling. Heaven, Tian, stands for cosmic moral control that chooses leaders based on merit. The emperor is the son of heaven, governing not by individual strength, but by godly naming. When lineages fail, it's deciphered as heaven retracting the mandate and bestowing it to fresh leaders. The framework permits political shift while upholding the rule that valid control always streams from above, never stems from below. And who deciphers whether a leader still holds the mandate? Scholars, priests, and court officials who examine celestial signs, uphold historical logs, and manage entry to the classical writings that outline proper ruling. Heaven stays the origin of control even when heaven never manifests. The motif turns unmistakable when inspected together. In the initial stage, deities govern straight stride among humans, render choices, evidently engage personally with worldly matters. In the second, deities withdraw into the sky, into concealed domains, into quiet. But their control over law, kingship, and cosmic order persists unaltered. In the third stage, priests, prophets, oracles, and ceremony experts turn vital pathways through which godly intent can be recognized and godly control can be applied on earth. And in the concluding stage, shrines, palaces, and managerial bureaucracies shape around the oversight of godly control, forming lasting structures that endure across generations. The deities may be missing, but the frameworks asserting godly sanction turn self-sustaining. This poses a query that standard answers find hard to resolve. If these motifs appear separately throughout societies that had no connection with each other, why do they meet on the identical answer? Either this stands for a universal mental tool, how human communities naturally structure control. We're shifting from tribal to state-level organization. Or it keeps a memory of something that really occurred in various places following similar motifs. Mainstream academics favor the initial answer. Godly kingship and priestly intercession are merely effective ruling technologies that appear naturally when societies turn complex enough to demand centralized control. But that answer doesn't tackle why the story format specifically includes existence, followed by retreat, rather than deities who were always remote, or control that was always human. Why? Does every lore recall an era when deities were nearer? But then, returning to Mesopotamia with keener attention, something even more particular emerges in the tool of persistence: bloodline. It's not sufficient that monarchs assert godly naming. They assert godly descent. Royal engravings don't merely say the deities selected them. They say the deities are their forebears. Kingship isn't just sanctioned from heaven. It's inherited through ancestry that follows back to godly source. The Sumerian King List features leaders portrayed as offspring of deities. Gilgamesh's saga marks him as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. His mother the goddess Ninsun, his father a mortal monarch. This isn't symbolic wording in the context of the culture that made it. It's genealogical assertion. Later Mesopotamian lineages persist this lore. Monarchs follow their validity through family chains that allegedly link back to godly chosen ancestors. The right to govern passes through blood, rendering certain families inherently holy. This motif stretches globally. Egyptian pharaohs are actually divine. Japanese emperors assert descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. European rulers will later assert divine right through apostolic sequence and holy bloodlines. Throughout societies, royal families safeguard their ancestry with obsessive attention, not merely for political gain, but because the ancestry itself bears the sanction to govern. Power doesn't merely assert godly source in the distant past. It asserts continuous link through biological heritage, which implies the retreat strategy is even more refined than simple institutional oversight. If control streams through bloodlines rather than through success or popular agreement, then the godly origin never truly turns irrelevant. It stays embedded in the bodies of the ruling group itself. The deities don't need to reappear if their control is actually inherited, handed down through generations like genetic recollection. This changes the query from how do communities uphold godly control after deities retreat to something more disturbing. How do you test control that asserts to be biologically descended from cosmic origins? You can't vote out a bloodline. You can't reform an heritage. You can't bargain with genealogy. If the deities don't govern openly anymore, why does power keep insisting it is inherited from them? And why does lineage turn the most safeguarded resource on Earth? The solution turns clear when you inspect how control defends itself across generations. Through blood. Godly naming solves the issue of starting validity, outlining why one person rather than another asserts the seat. But hereditary sequence solves an even more basic issue. How control perpetuates itself without demanding fresh godly stepping in for every leader. If kingship comes down from heaven once and then passes through biological ancestry, the framework turns self-maintaining. The deities need never reappear because their sanction streams through family chains like an inherited feature. This isn't emblematic wording in the context of ancient Near Eastern political concept. It's judicial truth. Mesopotamian monarchs routinely asserted not merely godly approval, but godly ancestry. Royal engravings portray leaders as offspring of specific deities, biological descendants, not just chosen attendants. Gilgamesh's status as two-thirds divine mirrors a genealogical assertion. His mother Ninsun was a goddess, rendering him actually part divine by blood. The Sumerian King List features leaders marked as sons or descendants of gods. Later Babylonian and Assyrian monarchs follow their validity through lineages allegedly founded by godly choice, with each generation inheriting the command through holy ancestry. Royal chants made for monarchs like Shulgi, who governed around 2000 BC, portray the ruler as selected in the womb by the deities shaped specifically for kingship before birth. This isn't metaphor. It's asserting that godly intent works through biological creation, choosing certain persons through their very conception. The implications are deep. If control is inherited biologically, then certain families turn inherently holy. Their blood bears validity. Their offspring are born with the right to govern embedded in their forms. Testing their control isn't merely political uprising, it's an attack on cosmic order itself. This is why royal unions turned matters of spiritual significance rather than mere political partnership. Holy marriage ceremonies in Mesopotamia involved ceremonial joining between the monarch and a high priestess standing for the goddess Inanna, reenacting a cosmic union that allegedly happened in mythic era. Strengthening the godly human link through symbolic procreation, monarchs didn't merely govern cities. They embodied the bond between heaven and earth. Each major Mesopotamian city upheld this format. The guardian deity possessed the city, lived in the central shrine, and named the monarch as earthly delegate. The monarch acted as the deity's manager, overseeing godly assets, imposing godly law, guiding festivals that upheld cosmic order. But the monarch was more than a worker. He was the living connection between the evident and unseen domains. Human enough to rule mortals, godly sanctioned enough to direct heavenly control. The seat turned the lasting emblem of godly existence after the deities retreated from immediate rulership. Think about what this signifies mentally for a society. The deities may no longer stride visibly in the streets, but they stay present through their named representative, who sits on the seat, wears the holy symbols, executes the necessary ceremonies, and embodies the cosmic order in human shape. The state turns the lingering image of godly governance, a format that keeps working as if the deities are still actively ruling, using human establishments as their tools. And because validity streams through bloodlines, royal families safeguard their lineages with obsessive attention, not merely for political gain, but because the ancestry itself bears the sanction to govern. Power doesn't merely assert godly source in the distant past. It asserts continuous link through biological heritage, which implies the retreat strategy is even more refined than simple institutional oversight. If control streams through bloodlines rather than through success or popular agreement, then the godly origin never truly turns irrelevant. It stays embedded in the bodies of the ruling group itself. The deities don't need to reappear if their control is actually inherited, handed down through generations like genetic recollection. This changes the query from how do communities uphold godly control after deities retreat to something more disturbing? How do you test control that asserts to be biologically descended from cosmic origins? You can't vote out a bloodline. You can't reform an heritage. You can't bargain with genealogy. If the deities don't govern openly anymore, why does power keep insisting it is inherited from them? And why does lineage turn the most safeguarded resource on Earth? The solution turns clear when you inspect how control defends itself across generations. Through blood. Godly naming solves the issue of starting validity, outlining why one person rather than another asserts the seat. But hereditary sequence solves an even more basic issue: how control perpetuates itself without demanding fresh godly stepping in for every leader. If kingship comes down from heaven once and then passes through biological ancestry, the framework turns self-maintaining. The deities need never reappear because their sanction streams through family chains like an inherited feature. This isn't emblematic wording in the context of ancient Near Eastern political concept. It's judicial truth. Mesopotamian monarchs routinely asserted not merely godly approval, but godly ancestry. Royal engravings portray leaders as offspring of specific deities, biological descendants, not just chosen attendants. Gilgamesh's status as two-thirds divine mirrors a genealogical assertion. His mother Ninsun was a goddess, rendering him actually part divine by blood. The Sumerian King List features leaders marked as sons or descendants of gods. Later Babylonian and Assyrian monarchs follow their validity through lineages allegedly founded by godly choice, with each generation inheriting the command through holy ancestry. Royal chants made for monarchs like Shulgi, who governed around 2000 BC, portray the ruler as selected in the womb by the deities shaped specifically for kingship before birth. This isn't metaphor. It's asserting that godly intent works through biological creation, choosing certain persons through their very conception. The implications are deep. If control is inherited biologically, then certain families turn inherently holy. Their blood bears validity. Their offspring are born with the right to govern embedded in their forms. Testing their control isn't merely political uprising. It's an attack on cosmic order itself. This is why royal unions turned matters of spiritual significance rather than mere political partnership. Holy marriage ceremonies in Mesopotamia involved ceremonial joining between the monarch and a high priestess standing for the goddess Inanna, reenacting a cosmic union that allegedly happened in mythic era, strengthening the godly human link through symbolic procreation. Monarchs didn't merely govern cities, they embodied the bond between heaven and earth. Each major Mesopotamian city upheld this format. The guardian deity possessed the city, lived in the central shrine, and named the monarch as earthly delegate. The monarch acted as the deity's manager, overseeing godly assets, imposing godly law, guiding festivals that upheld cosmic order. But the monarch was more than a worker. He was the living connection between the evident and unseen domains. Human enough to rule mortals, godly sanctioned enough to direct heavenly control. The seat turned the lasting emblem of godly existence after the deities retreated from immediate rulership. Think about what this signifies mentally for a society. The deities may no longer stride visibly in the streets, but they stay present through their named representative, who sits on the seat, wears the holy symbols, executes the necessary ceremonies, and embodies the cosmic order in human shape. The state turns the lingering image of godly governance, a format that keeps working as if the deities are still actively ruling using human establishments as their tools. And because validity streams through bloodlines, royal families safeguard their lineages with obsessive attention. Genealogies turn holy texts. Family trees turn spiritual documents. The purity of royal blood turns a matter of cosmic importance rather than merely social status. This motif stretches well beyond Mesopotamia. Egyptian pharaohs weren't merely godly named, they were gods embodied. Quite actually, the pharaoh was Horus on earth upholding Ma'at on behalf of the whole cosmic order. When the pharaoh passed, he turned Osiris, and his successor turned the new Horus. Divinity handed through biological sequence like a nobility title, except the title was living deity. Hebrew monarchs, though not asserting to be divine themselves, governed through anointing that set them apart, specially selected by God. The Davidic pact promised that David's ancestry would possess the seat forever. Biological descent from the right family turned spiritual need. Later, European monarchies built the idea of divine right of kings, the notion that royal control streams straight from God and cannot be validly tested by worldly strengths. Monarchs weren't merely politically strong, they were sacredly named, and their offspring inherited that sacred condition through blood. Japanese emperors asserted a straight descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, rendering the imperial family actually divine by ancestry. The emperor wasn't just selected by the deities. He was their biological descendant bearing divine essence in his bloodline. Throughout societies, the motif repeats. Control asserts source beyond humanity and embeds the assertion in hereditary sequence, rendering certain families inherently valid in ways that surpass human choice or worth. The brilliance of this framework is its durability. Deities who govern STR and embodies the cosmic order in human shape. The state turns the lingering image of godly governance, a format that keeps working as if the deities are still actively ruling using human establishments as their tools. And because validity streams through bloodlines, royal families safeguard their lineages with obsessive attention. Straight can be beaten, overthrown, or shown false. But control that works through bloodlines turns nearly impossible to test without ruining the whole conceptual setup of valid power. If you embrace that some families bear godly sanction in their blood, then political shift demands not merely armed win, but spiritual revolution. You can't merely replace one leader with another. You have to dismantle the whole structure of inherited holy control. This is why royal bloodlines turn the most safeguarded resource in old societies. They're not merely families. They're the vessels through which cosmic order stays linked to worldly ruling after the deities themselves have retreated from immediate oversight. The seat safeguards godly existence through biological persistence. But then in the later eras of Mesopotamian society, especially during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, something even more refined emerges in the historical archive. The deities don't merely retreat and leave control to hereditary leaders. They found systems of continuing surveillance. Vast sign literature kept from these eras discloses a society that thought the deities were constantly observing, constantly exchanging through indicators, constantly tracking human matters, even while staying bodily unseen. The deities aren't missing, they're watching. The difference counts hugely. Missing deities might ultimately be forgotten. Observing deities uphold perpetual mental existence, even without bodily display. Late Mesopotamian astronomy grows into an exact science precisely because celestial paths were deciphered as godly exchange, lunar eclipses, planetary meetings, unusual atmospheric events. All were logged carefully and linked with earthly happenings to form predictive patterns of godly aim. The deities converse through the sky. They dispatch notes through designs in nature. They disclose their intent through the setup of offered animal organs. They're always there, always observing, always exchanging. You just need the correct instruction to grasp their language. This forms a society living under constant godly supervision, without demanding godly manifestations. Monarchs render choices based on signs. Priests uphold detailed rules for prophecy before any key deed. The whole community aligns itself toward perceiving the intent of deities who are at once missing and everywhere, gone from view, but not from effect. If ancestry safeguarded godly control, what duty did signs, astrology, and prophecy play in upholding the sense that the deities were still tracking the world? The solution discloses something much more refined than simple spiritual lore. A framework crafted to uphold godly existence through watching rather than stepping in. By the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian eras, roughly 900 to 500 BC, Mesopotamian society had built what can only be outlined as surveillance theology. The deities weren't missing. They were observing, and they conveyed their watches through indicators that demanded professional deciphering. This wasn't superstition in the sense of arbitrary fear. It was methodical, logged, and handled as scientific wisdom. Massive gatherings of sign texts have been retrieved from sites like Nineveh and Babylon. Thousands of slabs cataloging links between celestial events and worldly happenings. These weren't vague foretellings. They were detailed conditional declarations following exact patterns. If an eclipse happens in the month of Nisan and the sky is dim, the monarch will perish and his son will capture the seat. If Jupiter positions in the Scorpion group, the yield will be plentiful. If the moon is encircled by a halo, there will be uprising in the land. The slabs log ages of astronomical watches paired with matching historical events, forming databases meant to disclose the designs, through which godly intent shows in the evident world. The reasoning is refined. If deities dwell in heaven, and heaven is constantly evident, then heaven's paths form a continuous note. The deities aren't quiet. You're just not examining carefully enough. Specialized priests called Baru, diviners, spent years instructing in the deciphering of these indicators. They upheld astronomical diaries logging lunar stages, planetary spots, weather events, and unusual celestial happenings. They consulted the gathered sign catalogs to decide what specific setups meant for the monarch, for the city, for war efforts, for the yield. They were examining the sky like a text penned in godly language. Think about the mental effect of living in such a society. Every eclipse turns a possible alert. Every odd cloud shape might indicate godly disapproval. Every meeting of planets bears meaning that must be unraveled. The deities never manifest in bodily shape, but their gaze is constant and unavoidable, shown through the unchanging math of celestial motion. You can't conceal from the sky. It observes everyone constantly. This forms a type of oversight more potent than immediate stepping in. When deities manifest bodily and issue orders, people might oppose, doubt, or probe the boundaries of godly control. But when deities exchange only through indicators that demand priestly deciphering, opposition turns impossible because you never quite recognize what the deities are declaring until the experts inform you. And who hires those experts? Who funds the watch sites? Who orders the sign examinations before key choices? The palace and the shrine. The identical establishments asserting godly sanction. Neo-Assyrian royal letters keep correspondences between monarchs and their court astrologers, disclosing how deeply this framework merged into political choice-making. Monarchs didn't merely consult signs for key war efforts. They postponed regular managerial deeds, delayed public manifestations, and changed travel arrangements based on astronomical watches. One letter from an astrologer to the Assyrian monarch Esarhaddon reads, "The king, my lord, should not exit on the 18th day. It is not favorable. The moon will be eclipsed. The king should stay within his palace." Another reports about the eclipse concerning which the monarch wrote to me. It is auspicious for the monarch. The eclipse has shifted to the monarch's foes. The diviners weren't merely noting celestial info. They were translating godly exchange into practical political data. And because deciphering is subjective, they could structure even menacing signs as verifications of royal approach. The eclipse occurs not because the deities oppose the monarch, but because they're alerting his foes. The framework turns self-strengthening. At the same time, this surveillance stretched beyond astronomy into every facet of daily existence. Extispicy, liver prophecy, stayed the main way for perceiving godly intent about specific queries. Before rendering significant choices, monarchs would order sacrifices and have trained experts inspect the organs for anomalies that showed godly sanction or alert. The livers themselves were mapped like bodily charts with emblematic meaning assigned to dozens of clay liver models that have been found covered in cuneiform engravings marking particular traits and their meanings. These weren't rough superstitions. They were technical guides for a specialized career that worked according to detailed procedural norms. Oil prophecy, smoke prophecy, dream deciphering all followed similar motifs. The godly domain constantly dispatches signals. Reality itself turns a text penned by the deities, and priests are the only ones instructed to examine it. This forms a society living under perpetual watching. Every choice, every deed, every scheme must be verified, against the chance that the deities have already conveyed their verdict through some indicator that hasn't yet been correctly deciphered. You don't merely act and wish for godly sanction. You hunt for godly signals before acting, and then act per what the indicators disclose. But observe what this framework doesn't demand. The deities themselves manifesting, conversing straight, stepping in bodily, or showing their being in ways that could be confirmed by common watching. The whole tool runs on the assumption that deities subsist, deities observe, deities exchange, but always through mediated pathways that demand specialized wisdom to reach. And what occurs if someone doubts whether the signs are authentic, whether the indicators truly bear godly meaning, whether the deities are really dispatching notes through eclipses and animals? They're doubting not merely spiritual lore, but the whole setup of political validity, legal control, and social order, because all of it relies on the assumption that power streams from godly origins that exchange through these exact pathways. To question the signs is to question kingship. To dismiss prophecy is to dismiss the cosmic sanction of law. The framework safeguards itself by rendering skepticism existentially risky. This is why the deities don't need to reappear. They've founded a ruling structure that works flawlessly in their non-presence. Indeed, perhaps works better in their non-presence, because bodily existence invites testing, doubting, and possible non-compliance. While unseen supervision upholds constant doubt about godly intent that can only be settled through institutional agents. The late Mesopotamian world doesn't forsake the Anunnaki. It refines the way of governing through them while they stay concealed. Monarchs still assert godly naming. Priests still manage entry to godly wisdom. Laws still bear heavenly control. And now, additionally, every political choice can be defended as reply to godly exchange delivered through celestial indicators that only experts can correctly decipher. The design turns complete. Hereditary bloodlines safeguard godly validity. Priestly establishments mediate godly intent. Ceremonial systems uphold godly approval, and sign deciphering provides ongoing godly surveillance, all without demanding the deities to bodily manifest. Which leads to the query that haunts this whole probe. If you aim to craft a framework of governance that could keep running indefinitely without demanding the bodily existence of the authorities who allegedly founded it, you would form exactly this: hereditary validity through holy bloodlines, institutional oversight of exchange pathways, legal setups asserting non-human source and surveillance tools that uphold the mental sense of being constantly watched by strengths that never need to disclose themselves. The Mesopotamian framework by the first millennium BC had turned precisely that. If the Anunnaki truly vanished, why did their ruling design stay so undamaged? Kingship, clergy, godly law, and surveillance by sign, almost like a framework crafted to operate without them. After inspecting thousands of years of Mesopotamian writings from the earliest Sumerian legends through the latest Babylonian astronomical logs, one fact turns unavoidable. There is no leaving story. No saga outlines the deities holding a concluding council and declaring their retreat from Earth. No ceremonial text honors a goodbye event. No monarch logs the instant divine entities ceased manifesting in the shrines. No priest documents the day the deities stopped replying to sacrifices. The writings simply cease portraying deities as immediate actors and begin portraying them as authorizing origins without ever admitting that anything altered. This quiet is itself the most disclosing proof. What we can follow is a slow alteration in mode across 3 clear stages. In mythic era kept in sagas like Atrahasis, Enuma Elish, and the Eridu Genesis, deities manifest as figures in stories. They argue in councils. They allocate domains. They form humanity. They step in disputes. They proclaim orders. They stride on earth as engaged members in the world's ruling. In historical era logged in royal engravings, shrine collections, and legal systems spanning roughly 3000 BC to 500 BC. Those identical deities turn the origins of control rather than its performers. Monarchs govern because the deities named them. Laws bear force because the deities created them. Shrines work because the deities possess them. But the deities themselves no longer manifest as actors in current happenings. They're summoned, mentioned, and asserted as control, but never portrayed as bodily evident in the way earlier legends showed them. In late astronomical era, especially during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, the deities change again into observers who exchange only through indicators. They're no longer missing, but they're no longer evident either. They subsist in a third condition. Constant watching without immediate stepping in. Perpetual exchange without bodily display. The shift between these modes isn't indicated by emergency or disaster in the surviving archive. It's fluid, natural, almost unseen, except in hindsight when you match writings from different eras and observe that the bond between deities and humans has basically restructured itself without anyone remarking on the alteration. The retreat is so silent, it might not even be termed a retreat at all. It's more like a reset-up. And yet this is the secondary peak. Nothing about how society works actually alters. After the deities cease manifesting as immediate actors, monarchs still govern by godly command, asserting sanction from entities who no longer visibly affirm their namings. Priests still decipher godly intent, mediating between the unseen godly domain and worldly community through ceremonies executed for deities who never bodily reply. Laws still bear heavenly control, imposing cosmic order on behalf of origins that can't be doubted, because they can't be reached except through institutional pathways. Shrines still work as godly dwellings and financial hubs, overseeing vast assets on behalf of proprietors who never gather rent in person. Prophecy systems still work as if every eclipse, every cloud shape, every anomaly in an offered liver is a note from deities who are constantly observing but never conversing straight. The apparatus persists without its handlers. More than persists, it flourishes. The systems, asserting godly source, turn more detailed, more established, more refined in the very era when godly existence turns most unseen. This is what renders the Mesopotamian archive so deeply disturbing. Power works without existence. Control functions without manifestation. And compliance persists without imposition. All upheld through a ruling design that acts exactly as if it were crafted to operate indefinitely in the non-presence of those who allegedly founded it. Which leads us to the concluding query. How do we decipher this motif? History provides 3 answers, each internally steady, each backed by different facets of the proof. The conventional scholarly deciphering handles godly governance as a validity technology, a story setup that early states employed to defend centralized control during the shift from tribal communities to complex societies. In this perspective, deities were never actually evident. They were always extensions of human political demands, embodiments of natural energies, or emblematic depictions of cosmic order. The retreat isn't a historical happening. It's a story development that happens as communities mature. Early states required formation legends displaying deities, founding society to reply to the query of where control stemmed. Later states required those identical deities to persist as authorizing origins, while human establishments did the real ruling. The advancement from godly actors to godly authorizers to godly observers mirrors humanity's growing refinement in structuring power without demanding supernatural answers. The proof backing this perspective, no excavation confirmation of godly entities ever subsisting, and thorough anthropological matches displaying how all complex communities build similar validity stories. An alternate deciphering proposes that legends keep distorted memories of real, historical truths, not deities in an actual supernatural sense, but earlier types of human society whose successes seemed so progressed to later cultures that they were recalled as godly. Perhaps the Anunnaki stand for recollections of a predecessor society whose wisdom, organization, or technology far surpassed what followed after some disastrous break. The retreat would then mirror actual historical fall, the conclusion of a progressed community whose frameworks were partly kept by survivors who no longer grasped their original origin. The deluge stories kept across cultures might log actual climatic disaster. The impossibly extended rules in the Sumerian King List might stand for compressed lineage eras or alternate time-tracking systems misgrasped by later copyists. The persistent assertion that society's basic establishments came down from heaven might keep memory that they originated from elsewhere, an earlier culture, a different area, a lost wisdom base. The proof backing this perspective, geological logs of disastrous climate happenings around 11,600 years ago, the excavation enigma of seemingly abrupt farming and building refinement in certain areas, and the steadiness of deluge mythology across unlinked cultures. The third deciphering, the one suggested by the query, what if the Anunnaki never really vanished, implies something more disturbing. Whether the deities were actual entities, emblematic builds, or recollections of earlier societies, the framework they founded acts exactly as if it were crafted to sustain itself without demanding their bodily existence. This isn't asserting the Anunnaki persist as forms or bodily beings. It's watching that they persist as design as the basic structure of how control, law, hierarchy, and validity work. If you aim to form a ruling framework that could keep directing society indefinitely without your immediate involvement, you would craft exactly what we witness in Mesopotamia. Control, asserting non-human source, rendering it undoubtable by human logic. Hereditary handing through bloodlines, rendering it biologically embedded rather than politically bargainable. Institutional agents managing all exchange pathways with the asserted godly origin. Surveillance tools upholding mental existence without bodily display. Legal setups offered as cosmic principles rather than human creations. The framework turns self-sustaining because every component mentions an origin beyond itself, forming circular confirmation that can't be tested without dismantling the whole structure. The proof backing this perspective, the remarkable endurance of godly kingship, priestly intercession, and sacred law across societies spanning millennia. The fact that these frameworks endured even after the deities they mentioned turned culturally forgotten. And the watching that modern ruling still works through many of these identical structural rules. Control asserting origins beyond popular intent establishments, mediating between citizens and power. Law offered as foundational rather than built. History doesn't provide a decision between these three answers. Each society must select which deciphering makes sense of the proof. Or perhaps accept that all three hold partial truth. that legends serve political duties, while also keeping recollections, while also forming self-sustaining frameworks that outlast their sources. What stays undeniable is the motif itself. Deities who once governed openly, then governed through agents, then governed through non-presence, and somehow the world kept complying. Maybe the Anunnaki didn't persist as entities. Maybe they persisted as plan, the basic design of how power structures itself when asserting validity beyond human agreement. And if that's accurate, then their greatest success wasn't coming down from heaven to found society. It was crafting society to work as if they never departed. If a society can be directed by and control, it never witnesses. How would we even identify the instant we ceased being governed by heaven?